Hello once again, this is Nick Hodges, the Delphi Product Manager, and I'm here for another edition of Turbo Delphi Demos. Now, the last few demos we've been doing some basics of classes and objects, and I think we've pretty much covered that. So now we're going to go on to some basic application development techniques, and we're going to do that through a series of these demos in which I start building a basic notepad-like application, an application that basically replicates the functionality of the notepad application that you have and use. What is it? Start, programs, accessories, notepad. Good old notepad. And we're going to try and build a notepad, and we'll actually try and do it a little better. So the way you do that, of course, the first thing you do is you want to start a new project. So we'll select a new VCL Forms application, and as we've done in some past demos, we're presented with a simple form. Now there's going to be a few things we want to do to the form to start off. First thing is we want to change its caption. We don't want it to say Form 13. We'll call our application here today TurboPad. And in addition to that, every object has a name. And in this case, our name is going to be, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to change this so that ours is arranged by name, because I personally find it easier to look up name alphabetically. So our name right now of the form is Form 13, and that's not very descriptive. A common way to name forms, especially the main form of an application, is to name it main form. Now visually you don't see any change to that, but if I flip over to the code tab, you'll notice now that we've got a class called tMainForm, right? And it's in unit 13. So now I'm going to save this, and instead of calling it unit 13, I'm going to prefix, this is a fairly common way to do things, I'm going to prefix my unit name with form, and then type it with FRM for form, and then call it main form. And I'm going to save it in my new directory called TurboPad. So now I've got a single unit in my application, and then the project we'll call TurboPad. And it'll be called TurboPad. That means the executable it creates will be called TurboPad as well. So now I've got a simple main form, and it's got a title TurboPad, and then its code is a simple declaration of a class that descends from tForm. The uses clause has been filled in with some of the common units that we will be using in our application. And we've got a variable here declared called main form. Now that's actually a unit within our application. Now previously I've been using console applications, and if I go right-click View Source on the executable name or the project name, you'll notice that I do have a program here called TurboPad. It uses two units. It uses the Forms unit and the FRM main form unit. And you notice that in between the main, begin, and the end are three calls: application initialize, application create form, and application run. An application is a global object that's created in the forms unit, and it is the main object that does all the work of creating and running an application in the VCL. And the actual instance of the form, our main form, is created here, and then the application runs, which will in fact create and instantiate and display the main form that we created here. Generally speaking, you won't ever worry about this main form file when dealing with a forms application. Mainly what we'll be working with here today and in coming demos is the actual unit that holds our main form. So now if we go back to the designer, if we want our application to look like Notepad, just for starters, main thing you see in Notepad is two things. One is this editing area, and two is this menu. So we will drop on our form, therefore, a tMain menu application, or a component. Now, tMain menu is a non-visual component, meaning that if I save and run the application, we won't see it. In design time, we can see a little square here representing the component, but at runtime, we see nothing. However, the main form does have a runtime representation. So if I select the form, double-click on it, it will bring up the main form designer. And that will allow me to design a main form. And we're going to build the main form gradually over the course of the demos. But for starters today, we're going to add a new unit or new item on the menu called File. Now notice I selected this item here, typed File, and I now have a menu called File here. And then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put a single entity in here, another item, menu item called Exit. And now if I want to have something happen on the File Exit menu, I can double click on this exit and it will bring up in the code editor an event handler for the click or the selection of the exit menu item. And what we want to have happen when I click and select this menu item is we want the application to end, close, exit. And the way you do that in Pascal, or in the VCL more specifically, is you simply call close on the main form. So you can call close here. Now if I save this application and run it, you notice now we actually have a menu here. If I select the menu, I have an exit item. If I click exit, close is called and the application shuts down. Now another common menu that we get is the help menu. The help menu is usually the last menu to the far right, and almost all applications have an about box. And I'm going to therefore add an about box to our application. Now, normally for the caption of a menu item that brings up another dialog, you put an ellipse at the end. So now we have an about box. And again, I want to have the about box show up when we click on this menu. Now, of course, in order to have an about box show up, we have to have an about box. And we get an about box by creating a new form for the application. So I can right-click on our project and select Add New Form. And now you'll notice that I get a new form in the designer. It's in Unit 1. I'm going to go ahead and save this. I'm going to say FRM about box, FRM meaning it's a form, and then the about box is the name of the form. I'm going to change the caption to say about turbo pad, and I'm going to change the name of our form to about box. So now you know, again, notice again, we have a code in our code at tab, we have T about box, and it's a basic box. Now with the designer, now I can take, say, a nice label, and I can put it on there, and I can say that I can give the caption of the label to say something like about turbo pad. And I can take that and center it up, and I can go down to the font, and I can make the font a whole heck of a lot bigger. I can make it bold. I can make the color something a little more interesting, like say red, and then the size something more interesting to say 24, and now I might put that up there. And we could pretty this up later, but for right now I'm going to go ahead and center this thing up a little bit and size the form. Now every about box needs a button to close it, an OK button. So I'm going to drop a button on here, and then I'm going to right click, I'm going to select position, align, and I want to center it horizontally in the window. I'm going to do the same for this label, right click, position, align, center in window. So now I've got it a little spaced up. Now this button, I can just come down here and I can set a property on here called the modal result to MROK, and I can change its caption to just say OK. And so now because the modal result property is set to MROK, we'll see in a little bit how this works when I show the form, but pressing the button will now close the form because the modal result is set to something other than none. But in a minute we'll see how that works. So now we've got an about box. It's in the unit FRM about box. So now we can go back to FRM main form. Now, since we're going to create an instance of this about box and show it from the main form, we need to use the unit that the form is in. So we are going to use the about box unit, FRM about box. Now, when we go to our designer, I can come over to the double click on the menu designer. I can come to the help menu. I can double click on the about box, and now we will show the about box. And the way we show the about box is the about unit. I'm going to close the menu designer here. The about box unit, you'll notice, has in it a variable called about box. Now, by default, I'm opening up the options menu here. By default, the VCL designer will auto-create forms and data modules for you. What that means is once you declare a form, it will create an instance of that form and have it available for you using this default variable right here called about box. So back on the main form, when we click the about box menu item, we can simply say about box dot, and then we'll call a method on the about box, which is a form method of T-form called show modal. Now, what show modal does is it displays the given form as a modal dialog box. Now, a modal dialog box is a dialog box that commands complete attention from the application. A non-modal dialog box is a dialog box that shows up but allows you to continue to use other forms in the application. Now, about box is a simple form. We're just going to display it, and thus we don't need any modality here. So I'm going to save the application, and now if we run the application, we get Turbo, and we go help about, and you'll notice that TurboPad shows up, and now we have an about box. Now, here's some of the problems. First of all, you'll notice that it popped up right up here. We maybe want it to pop up right in the center of this application. The other thing you notice is it's sizable, and it's kind of goofy to have it sizable. But the third thing you'll notice is if I try and click on any of these back here, portion back here, you can't, because that is this is a modal dialog box, and it was called using show modal. I can click OK, and it'll take me back to the application. I can go File, Exit, and now our application will disappear. But let's do a few things to square up those little problems with the designer. First of all, in the designer, we'll come along and we'll take the window, and we're going to go ahead and set the border style to be BS dialog. And what that will do is that'll change the window from being a sizable window to being a dialog. So now when I run and bring up the about box, you'll notice that I can't size it anymore. It's a non-sizable, and that's cool. That's the way we want it. The next thing we can do is we notice that when we run our application, main form, let's bring the designer up. When we run the application, you'll notice that it starts in the upper left-hand corner up here a bit. We don't necessarily like that. We can use this little designer key down here to decide where each form will go. And the second form here, we can bring up form about box, and now we can move our little form around so it down here so that it'll appear here. Or actually, we can go down to the position property, and we can set it to main form center, and then the about box will actually show up centered in the main form itself. So now TurboPad's located a little bit better, and now you notice about TurboPad, the about box shows up right in the middle of our main form. If we were to size it like this, you'll notice that it does the calculation, and again still shows up in the middle. Now, here's a little thing I want to show you. I showed you in a second ago that in the Tools Options menu item under the VCL Designer that Auto Create Forms and Data Modules is checked. I'm going to uncheck this because I think that as a default it's bad practice. For beginners, it usually works, so you only have to make that one call, about box show modal. But you guys know how to create and destroy objects now that we've shown you. So I'm going to show you a more efficient way to do this. And the reason that you don't want to auto-create forms and data modules is that when the application is, if this is checked and the application and the items are auto-created, there'll be all your data dialog boxes, windows, and all the other things associated with Windows in your application will all be created at once at startup, and then be maintained in memory throughout the entire life of your application, and then only freed and the memory will only be released at the end when your application is closed. It's more efficient to create dialog boxes as needed and then free them when they're not needed, like an about box. There's no reason to keep an instance of an about box hidden but in memory the whole time. And how this works is, once again, we'll go to our application. I'll go right-click on the project and go View Source. And you'll notice now that we've had an additional item entered into our main application here since we looked at it last, and that is this call to application create form T about box. And that creates an instance of the about box, hides it so it can't be seen, and lets it sit in memory while you're sitting around waiting to show it. And there's no efficiency in that. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to delete this line here so that no longer is the about box created at startup. And now I'm going to come into the about box code, and I'm actually indeed going to remove this variable name because we don't need this variable name anymore. But I actually am going to cut it. Going to cut it. Well, all right, maybe not. Remove the variable declaration entirely, and now over in the main form under our code, I'm going to declare a local variable inside of our procedure of the same name. And instead of just calling about box show modal, since the form is no longer automatically created, I have to create an instance of it myself. And the constructor for a form takes a owner. And in our case, we want our main form, which is self. The main form itself. Self is a variable that resides in all objects that always refers back to the object that is being coded in. So in this case, self refers back to the main form. And then I'm going to call try. I'm going to call about box show modal. And then when I'm done with the about box, after it has been shown modaled and somebody clicked OK, I'm going to free it. Now the application behaves exactly the same as before, but it's has a much more effective use of memory because the scope of the about box is not a global variable like it was before in the about box menu, in the about box unit here, but its scope is that of a local procedure. That's much more memory efficient, and it's the better practice to create things when you need them, destroy them when you don't. So now run it, and you'll notice that the about box pops up. So just like before, I click OK, and it's gone. I can file, exit, and the application has an about box. And in the next lesson, we'll start adding some text inside of the main window. So that'll do it for our basic application of TurboPad. Thanks for looking and watching, and we'll keep going with TurboPad in the next few demos.